So here at the School of Advanced Studies for the last 2 years, I've been working as part of the material relations team. The idea behind this team was, it starts with a problem, and the problem was that there's something fundamentally wrong, there's something destructive, there's something unsustainable about human relations with the material world. I think this is a truism, right? We know this, like we're in a time of ecological crisis, we're in an age of mass consumption and waste, environmental disaster, right? So the idea is that maybe it's not just the practices that are wrong, right? It's not just that we're producing too much fossil, or consuming too many fossil fuels or producing too much plastic. Obviously it's not. That's what the problem we say is, that it's actually our orientation to matter itself, that we need a new idea of our relationship with humans and the relationship between humans and materials to change practices. Now, you can't change practices alone, you have to change the ideas behind the practices, right? My role in material relations, in our attempt to rethink this relationship between humans and materials, has been a historical one. To go back 1,000 years, to go back into the medieval Western past, and to try and uncover some relationships between humans and materials that might challenge our relationships in the present. In other words, to find something, some path not taken in the past, some way of thinking about creation, material world, that might, I'm not saying it's going to be directly useful in the present, but might jolt us, might shock us, might act as some kind of paradigm that might help our thoughts today. The Middle Ages is quite unique in its relationship with the material world. There's a huge paradox in medieval Christian ideas of matter. On the one hand, there's a long history of suspicion of matter, right? That matter itself is something to be overcome. That the body itself is essentially, is something evil even. Like in some theories of Christianity, in Manichaean heresy, the body is created by the devil. The material world itself is satanic, and it needs to be overcome, and we need to discover the spiritual, non-corporeal world of paradise. All right, that's the more extreme end of the spectrum, but everyday Christianity 1,000 years ago, there's this idea that you should overcome this world and reach the non-corporeal spiritual world beyond. So through intense monastic devotion and prayer, you can come to have this mystical experience with God, right? And it's non-bodily. You can escape this animal prison. The most extreme example of that are the Cathar heretics, who believed that souls were trapped in bodies, and that you should not reproduce, you should not have sex, because it just reproduces the material world, which we need to escape. On the other hand, medieval Christianity is extremely obsessed with the material world. Material things can be highly productive in devotional exercise. Relics are extremely popular. People come from all over Europe to see the shrine of someone like Thomas Becket and to take his blood relic with them and wearing it in a vial around their neck, because the physicality of that blood will have some power for them. Stained glass windows produce a spectacular effect on one's devotion, in theory. See what else? There are miracles that involve objects all the time. Saints move things around, they make water bubble up. The material world, in other words, can be infused with miraculous power, but can also be a bridge to some kind of higher understanding. Through objects you might understand something that you can't do just by thinking alone. And of course the Eucharist wafer is the high culmination of that. Around about the year 1200, just after, there's this new enthusiasm for communion, and there's this idea that, and it's finally begun formally in 1215, that when you eat the wafer in the Eucharist, the Christian ceremony, that you're not just eating a representation of the body of Christ, you are really eating the body of Christ. You are ingesting that body. It's a much more of the body itself, matter plays a much more important role there. Equally, of course, there's this idea, this obsession with your own body, that your body is not just something to be overcome, but it's an instrument of your salvation, and it will be there at the time of your redemption. All of your fingernails will come back at your time of ascension to paradise. All of your hair will come back. All of it matters, right? All of the stuff of your body is part of you. It matters. It's not something to be forgotten. So there's this paradox, right? So what's the importance of matter then? Something to be overcome or something to be used? My research has looked at I'll talk about two examples of medieval relationships with matter that challenge us, I believe, to think in new ways about our relations with materials today. The first of these is a relic, a bone relic. It's the shin bone of the Saint Mary Magdalene. Okay, it was kept as a holy relic in an abbey in northern France. This shin bone becomes a very strange vehicle to someone's devotional practice in one little episode. There's a bishop called Hugh of Lincoln in the late 12th century who's doing a tour of France, and he's a devotee of relics. He wants to see all of the major relics in the region. And he goes to Fécamp and he asks the abbot, "Can I see the shin bone of Mary Magdalene? I know you have it." And the abbot says, "Well, because you are a prominent bishop, of course you can see." And he says, "Can I touch the shin bone too?" The abbot says, "Well, yes, of course you can touch the shin bone." Hands it to him. Bishop Hugh turns away and he starts to eat the shin bone. He puts it in his mouth and splinters it. 2 pieces of bone splinter off. And the abbot is shocked. "What are you doing?" And Bishop Hugh defends himself. He says, "Well, I'm showing my devotion." He says, "Just as in the Eucharist we eat the body of Christ, it's not so strange for me now to be eating the bone of Mary Magdalene." It's a bizarre moment, but for me it reveals a relationship with the material spiritual object, which is very interesting. Relics have often been seen, right, as just symbols, right? A lot of historians write about them as if they're just functional. A church will own a relic because it's a symbol of their institutional prestige, legitimacy. People will own relics almost as commodities. Yes, people pray to relics and there's a sense that they are imbued with a power, but it's also kind of symbolic, right? But here, with Hugh attempting to eat the relic, it's like there's something that cannot be obtained just by contact. Some power in the relic that cannot be obtained just by looking at it or thinking about it or being in its presence. You need to actually ingest it. And I think what Hugh is drawing attention to is that kind of inscrutable, irreducible, inobtainable power that the object has. Its essence, which is beyond our reach. Graham Harman, the philosopher of object-oriented ontology, writes about a third object, right? You've got the reduced object, which is just matter particles. We can reduce an object just down to its chemical composites. That's a reduction. Another reduction for Harman is when we reduce an object to its effects. What does it do for people in the world? The relic, performs a kind of power. He says, well, there's another object, right? And it's kind of, it's a gap between these two. And I feel that for Hugh of Lincoln, when he's trying to eat this bone, he's trying to access that other relic. That relic that's more than just a symbol, it's more than just an object, a bone, it's something else. It has its own power and essence that we as humans cannot access. And that's object number one. And it's interesting because Hugh is doing this at a time when relics are more popular than ever. And in many ways I see him as kind of rebelling against the people who just use relics as commodities. And in other ways I see him, I suppose, as participating in a deeply skeptical movement, people who are deeply skeptical about objects as symbols. There's a group called the Petrobrusians, right? This group of heretics, and they say they don't want any crucifixes, burn all of the crucifixes, right? Because we shouldn't be worshipping an object, we should just think about Christ. We should burn all the churches. We don't need churches because we don't need the object of the church, we just need our ideas. And these guys are seen as very, very extreme heretics. And Peter of Bruys, the founder of this tradition, ends up getting pushed into a fire and burned because there's so much outcry at this. Now, Hugh of Lincoln, I see, even though seemingly he's nothing like this, right? He wants the object. I feel like he's part of that skeptical movement because it's saying the symbol is not enough. The symbol is not enough. It's not truly powerful. I think the Petrobrusians are extreme, right? They don't want any symbols, but maybe Hugh is kind of part of that extremist. He's part of that movement because he wants a real object. He doesn't want symbols. Second item, I suppose, second object that I focused on has been, it's not really an object, but a material substance, which is fire. Fire has there's a long discourse in the medieval world about fire as having its own power, right? It's a power of purifying things, right? Fire can purify you, you know, so heretics are burned because we need to purify this corrupt body of the heretic. People are tried in fire, you know. If you're accused of something which you cannot prove you didn't do, sometimes you're forced to walk through fire to prove that you're innocent, right? The fire will purify you, or the fire will test you, right? But there's this fascinating encounter. Francis of Assisi, the 13th century saint, talks about fire in a very strange way. There's this moment where Francis is sitting at a fire with his brothers, and his trousers catch fire. Francis's trousers are on fire. And the other brothers say, "Oh my God, this is terrible, put the fire out, put the fire out." And Francis says, "No," and he's burning. "No, leave it. Let brother fire, do not get in the way of what brother fire wants." It's an absurd moment. Now, is it a joke? Good question. But I think Francis is suggesting there that fire has its own will, its own desire. Maybe he's suggesting it as a joke, but as I believe, the joke still expresses some kind of truth, right? The joke expresses something. What does Francis mean by fire having its own will? Well, it seems absurd, but if we actually dig into 13th century texts and ideas and theologians and academics, we start to see that there is popular support, or not popular support, there's intellectual support for this idea that fire itself has a will or its own reason. On the one hand, scholars such as Robert Grosseteste, a follower of Francis in many ways, write about fire as being the element which is contained in all things. It is the substance which is everywhere present. In our eyes, in all of our physicality, there is fire somewhere, a small spark. More than that, for Grosseteste, fire is the substance of heaven itself. The celestial sphere is a fiery sphere. This is, and so on the one hand, fire has a will, well, because it is the essence of being. On the other hand, another scholar, also by chance a follower of St. Francis, Bonaventure, writes about fire as having, well, he doesn't write about fire, but he writes about substances like fire as having a will of their own. For Bonaventure, he says, will and matter complete each other, right? So the physical world and the non-physical world complete each other. Okay, so the physical world is not just a support for the non-corporeal world. The body is not just a support for the soul. They are reciprocal. They need one another to complete one another. And he says, Bonaventure, that just as reason is a mental process, then matter also has its own reason. That just as the mind desires its completion in the physical world or whatever, the physical world, the body or matter, also desires its completion in the non-corporeal world. So there's an idea that matter itself has a reason, has a will, has a desire. Can fire love? Well, that's more radical, isn't it? Francis of Assisi does write about a kind of loving union between humans and objects. You know, listen to what fire wants. Angela Foligno, a follower of St. Francis, talks about this burning passion within her, which was a fire. She felt the love of God so intensely that she felt it was a fire within her, and she tried to extinguish it by applying a flame to herself, and specifically to her body. And it's an extraordinary moment, but I feel that it expresses this idea that, you know, the physical fire is needed to combat the non-corporeal fire or whatever, that they're completing one another, that they are one and the same, or that fire itself is a very physical thing, that the fire that you feel inside you, the fire of love, is a real fire, that it's a real fire that burns, and that ultimately perhaps, and later a writer like Marguerite Porete, who's a mystic in the early 14th century, writes about the human and fire as being indistinguishable. When you are so in love with God, you burn as if you were a fire. You almost become that fire of God. It's like you've reached that celestial sphere of fire that Bonaventure talks about. That your desires then are in conjunction with a physical world desire. That the soul's desire for completion with God is in conjunction with, or is in some way blended with, some mysterious desire of the physical world. What does all of this mean for present-day material relations? Well, I think that these extraordinary examples can be we could see them as paradigms for thinking about matter, or maybe they can just be ways of shocking us into remembering that we're not limited to an instrumental or a sort of reductive view of the material world, that maybe if we think like medieval people did, that there is some reason, desire, will, love even in material things, that this can think about our ethical responsibilities towards them differently. And if we also remember, like Hugh of Lincoln did, trying to bite the relic, that there's an essence in matter which we cannot grasp, that is always beyond us, it might help us to think more benevolently, or to have more respect, I think, for materials.